That night on the America's Got Talent stage, a grandfather looked into his grandson's eyes and confessed the mistake he made 15 years ago. Simon Cowell couldn't hold back his tears. The lights came up on the AGT stage. Another Tuesday night audition. Another packed theater. Another round of hopefuls waiting to impress the judges with their talents. Terry Crews walked to center stage with his trademark enthusiasm. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our next act." An elderly man walked onto the stage. Late 60s, maybe early 70s. Gray hair neatly combed. Pressed slacks and a simple button-down shirt. No costume. No props. Just a man walking slowly, deliberately, toward the microphone stand at center stage. Behind him, a teenage boy followed. Maybe 14 or 15 years old. Jeans and a t-shirt. Nervous energy. The kind of kid who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else but was there because it mattered. Simon Cowell leaned back in his chair at the judge's desk, arms crossed, that familiar expression of skeptical curiosity on his face. Howie Mandel tilted his head. Heidi Klum smiled encouragingly. Sofia Vergara leaned forward with interest. Terry approached the pair on stage. "Hello? And you are?" "My name is Robert Chen," the older man said, his voice steady but quiet. "I'm 68 years old. From San Francisco. And who's this handsome young man with you?" Terry gestured to the teenager. "This is my grandson, Michael. He's 14. The audience applauded politely. Simon uncrossed his arms, already sensing something was different about this audition. In 15 years of judging talent shows, he'd developed an instinct for when someone was about to do something unexpected. "So Robert," Terry continued, "what will you be doing for us today?" Robert looked down at the microphone in his hands. He was gripping it tightly, knuckles white. When he looked back up, his eyes were glistening. "I'm not here to sing," Robert said. "I'm not here to dance or do magic tricks or any kind of performance you're expecting." The theater went quiet. Terry glanced toward the judge's table uncertainly. "Then why are you here?" Simon's voice cut through the silence, not harsh but genuinely curious. Robert turned to face the judges directly. "I'm here because 15 years ago, I made the worst mistake of my life. And I need to tell my grandson what I did. In front of witnesses. In front of the world. Because he deserves to know the truth, and I've been too much of a coward to tell him." Simon stopped the show. No one knew what was happening. The control room erupted into chaos. Producers were shouting into headsets. "What is this? Did we vet this act? What's happening on stage?" On stage, Terry Crews didn't know what to do. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't how auditions worked. He looked to the judges for guidance. Simon held up one hand, the gesture for wait. His eyes were locked on Robert Chen, on the way the old man's hands trembled as he held the microphone, on the teenager standing beside him looking confused and increasingly worried. "Robert," Simon said, his voice gentler than usual. "This is a talent competition. We're looking for singers, dancers, acts that can perform. What you're describing. I'm not sure this is the right platform." "I know," Robert said, his voice cracking slightly. "But my grandson loves this show. He watches it every week. He believes in golden buzzers and second chances and people getting to share their stories. And I thought maybe if I did this here, in front of him and all these people, I couldn't take it back. I couldn't keep hiding." Michael touched his grandfather's arm. "Grandpa, what are you talking about? What mistake?" Robert looked at his grandson, and tears began streaming down his weathered face. "Michael, your father, my son David, died when you were 6 months old. Car accident. You've grown up without him. And your whole life, I've told you that I did everything I could to be there for your dad, that I was a good father to him, that he knew I loved him." He paused, struggling to continue. "That was a lie." The theater was completely silent. 4,000 people holding their breath. Simon Cowell sat utterly still, his skeptical expression gone, replaced by something else. recognition, understanding. The look of someone who knew exactly where this story was going because he'd carried similar regrets himself. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened 15 years earlier. Robert Chen had been a successful investment banker in San Francisco. 70-hour work weeks. International clients. Conference calls at midnight. The kind of career that paid extremely well and demanded everything. His son David had been 23 years old, fresh out of college, trying to figure out his life. David wanted to be a musician, not the kind that plays stadiums, but the kind that teaches kids and plays coffee shops and finds meaning in the small moments of creating art. Robert had hated that dream. He'd paid for Stanford. He'd given David every advantage. And his son wanted to play guitar in dive bars for tips. They'd fought about it constantly. Bitter arguments where Robert said things he regretted the moment they left his mouth. "You're wasting your potential. You're throwing your life away. I didn't sacrifice everything to raise a failure." The final fight had been the worst. David had come to his father's office downtown. He'd just found out his girlfriend was pregnant. He was terrified and excited and needed his father's support. Robert had been in the middle of a crucial merger. Stressed. Exhausted. When David said he was going to be a father and still planned to pursue music, still wasn't going to get a real job, Robert had exploded. "Then don't expect any help from me," Robert had said, his voice cold with fury. "You want to throw your life away? Fine. But I won't watch it happen. I won't be part of it. Dad, please. Get out of my office, David. And don't come back until you're ready to grow up." David had left. Robert had returned to his merger documents, telling himself his son would come around, would eventually see reason, would realize his father was right. 3 weeks later, David was driving home from a late-night gig at a small club. A drunk driver ran a red light. David died instantly. He never got to meet his son Michael. He never got to reconcile with his father. And Robert Chen had spent the last 15 years living with the knowledge that the last words he'd spoken to his son were, "Get out of my office." Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this performance is still ahead. On the AGT stage, Robert was crying openly now, still looking at Michael, who stood frozen in shock. "Your father came to me for help," Robert said, his voice breaking. "He told me about you. That you were coming. That he was scared but happy. And I told him to leave. I told him I wouldn't support him. I said terrible things because I was angry that he wouldn't live the life I wanted for him." Michael's face was pale. You told me you and Dad were close. You said." "I lied," Robert interrupted. "We hadn't spoken in 3 weeks when he died. He died thinking I didn't love him. He died thinking I was ashamed of him. And the worst part is, I was ashamed of my own son for following his dreams instead of mine." The judges sat in stunned silence. Howie had tears streaming down his face. Heidi was covering her mouth. Sophia had her hand over her heart. And Simon Cowell, the judge known for his harsh critiques and emotional distance, was leaning forward with both elbows on the desk, one hand over his mouth, his eyes glistening with tears. "After your father died," Robert continued, "I found his guitar in his apartment. And a notebook full of songs he'd written. Beautiful songs. Songs about becoming a father. Songs about hope and fear and love. And one song. He had to stop, compose himself. One song called For My Dad, about wanting to make me proud." Robert reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges from being carried for years. "This is that song. The lyrics he wrote. I've carried it every day for 15 years. And I've never had the courage to read it all the way through because it breaks my heart to know he died thinking I wasn't proud of him when the truth is I was wrong. About everything. He wasn't the failure. I was." Michael was crying now too, standing on stage next to his grandfather, tears streaming down his young face. Why didn't you ever tell me? Michael asked, his voice small. Because I was ashamed, Robert said simply. Because I didn't want you to know that your grandfather was the kind of man who chose his pride over his son. Because I've spent 15 years trying to be the grandfather I should have been as a father, and I was terrified that if you knew the truth, you'd hate me the way I hate myself. Backstage, producers were begging him to continue, but he didn't. Simon Cowell stood up. The action was so unexpected that the entire theater gasped. Judges didn't stand during auditions. They sat. They listened. They critiqued. They didn't stand. But Simon was standing, looking at Robert Chen on stage, and something in his expression had changed completely. Robert, Simon said, his voice rough with emotion. I need to stop you for a moment. Robert looked terrified, like he'd made a terrible mistake, like security was about to escort him off stage. I lost my father 6 years ago, Simon continued, and now his voice was definitely trembling. And one of the last conversations we had was an argument. About business. About decisions I'd made that he didn't agree with. We reconciled before he died, but I carried that argument with me for months, wondering if he knew how much I loved him, wondering if I'd said the right things. He paused, visibly fighting for composure. And I cannot imagine, carrying that weight for 15 years. Living with those last words. Never getting the chance to take them back. Simon looked at Michael. You need to understand something. Your grandfather isn't here to audition for this show. He's here because he loves you so much that he's willing to destroy his own image, to expose his deepest shame, to make sure you know the truth. That takes more courage than any performance I've ever seen on this stage. The audience erupted in applause. Not the excited applause of entertainment, but the quiet, reverent applause of people witnessing something sacred. Simon wasn't finished. He stepped out from behind the judge's desk, something he'd done maybe 3 times in 15 seasons, and walked toward the stage. But what happened next, no one in the theater, or watching at home, could ever forget. Simon climbed onto the stage itself. Terry Crews stepped back, understanding this moment belonged to someone else. The other judges watched with tears in their eyes. Simon walked directly to Robert Chen, who stood frozen, still holding that worn piece of paper with his dead son's lyrics. May I see it? Simon asked gently, gesturing to the paper. Robert handed it over with trembling hands. Simon unfolded it carefully. Read the first few lines. His jaw tightened. He read a few more. A tear rolled down his cheek. Simon Cowell, crying on live television, reading the words of a dead man to his father. This is beautiful, Simon said quietly. Your son had real talent. Real heart. He looked at Michael. Your father wrote this for your grandfather because despite everything, despite the arguments and the disappointment, he loved him. That's what this song is about. Not anger. Love. Simon folded the paper carefully and handed it back to Robert. Then he did something that would define this moment forever. He removed his watch, an expensive piece he wore every episode, and placed it in Robert's hands. This was my father's, Simon said. He gave it to me before he died. And I'm giving it to you because I need you to understand something. It's not too late. You still have your grandson. You still have time. Don't waste another 15 years carrying shame when you could be building something beautiful. Robert stared at the watch in his hands, then at Simon, unable to speak. Simon turned to Michael. Your grandfather made a terrible mistake. But he's here. He's telling you the truth. That's what love looks like when it finally finds courage. Michael looked at his grandfather, at this man who'd raised him, who'd hidden this pain for so long, and stepped forward. He wrapped his arms around Robert and held on tight. The theater exploded. Standing ovation. 4,000 people on their feet, crying, applauding, bearing witness to forgiveness happening in real time. Simon walked back to the judges' table. Without a word, without hesitation, he slammed his hand down on the golden buzzer. Golden confetti rained down on the stage. Robert and Michael stood in the shower of gold, holding each other, while Simon Cowell stood at his desk with tears streaming down his face. Share and subscribe, so this story will never be forgotten. Robert Chen never performed. But the video of that moment has been watched over 200 million times. Simon kept in touch with both of them. On Michael's 18th birthday, Simon sent him David's song professionally recorded by a Nashville studio. The watch Simon gave Robert sits in a frame in their home. Next to it, a photo of David playing guitar, finally honored for who he was.